It's little Edith Winthrop who sees the strange woman first. She sits in her bed, gazing towards the window at her side, and the deep forest that borders the estate, sad and bored. The books and puzzles lumped at the foot of the bed are finished, and in record time, too. Edith has always been considered quite bright for her age. Her mother often calls her my little light bulb, in display of affection that would likely shock the other women in her friend circle. But Edith just considers herself very well read. It's not like there's much else to do. All of her family's wealth can't buy her a better immune system. She'd been laid up with pneumonia for a good deal of last month, and this month, it's a cold that has evolved into a nasty and tenacious flu. Very nasty, her doctor had said in that tired, what am I doing here again voice that never fails to kindle a hot wrath in her guts. What's it matter? What is it anyway? She thinks bitterly, as she pulls her comforter tight around her shoulders and weathers another coughing fit. They always seem to want to tell her what the illness of the month is, but in the end, it's just another stumbling block between her and a childhood that's steadily slipping away. Tears, hot and feverish, rise unbidden and unwanted, and she sits up and turns her gaze out the window, as she lets her mind wander into obscurity until her eyes are dry. When she lets things come into focus, the woman has crossed from the forest into their lawn. She's an arresting sight in the way that Edith imagines the Red Death had to have been when it showed up at Prince Prospero's party. Striking, but in an uneasy way. Even from a few yards away, and as blurred by the gray haze of rain and mist as she is. The woman's very tall enough maybe to match her imposing scarecrow of a father, and dressed like a Victorian aristocrat, all bell-shaped skirts and puffy shoulders, all of which are the color of holly berries. The red stands out poisonously in the gloom, tempting rather than inviting, and the image is made worse by the mask that the woman wears. It covers her entire head, and bulges at the back where her hair would be pressing up against it. It's blue-white like the eggs Edith's father sometimes gets at the farmer's market, and mottled in some unpleasant way. At a distance, it's hard for Edith to tell exactly what kind of face it's supposed to be, outside of it having eyes and a strangely shaped mouth, but she can be certain that it isn't something a proper lady would ever wear, not even in the most macabre Halloween party or the most competitive costume contest. The woman moves, and Edith shudders at the way her arms bend and her feet tap nimbly forward. It's like she's dancing on invisible wires, and as Edith watches, she dances right over the low stone wall that separates their land from the woods, and onto the lawn. Suddenly she can feel the cold of the glass through her thick comforter, and the faint blue and red roses stenciled into the wallpaper become bright and unearthly. Something in the walls begins to scrabble madly at the plaster. It squeals muffled, and she's suddenly more aware of the phlegm in the back of her throat and in her lungs than she's ever been before. There's a buzzing in her ears, and she's aware that she's doubled over, hacking and coughing. When she looks up, the woman is twirling and leaping across the lawn, past the house. The grass beneath her seems to shiver beyond the ministrations of the rain. Then she's gone, her horrible redness vanishing behind the side of the house and out of sight. Edith gives one last barking cough, and then the world returns to normal. The rat in the walls stops its mad clawing. The roses in the wallpaper return to being dull, printing drawings, and the grass goes still. The warmth is the last to return, but Edith barely notices. She curls in on herself, thin arms wrapped around knobby knees as she shudders and listens, imagining that awful woman opening the front door, creeping into the foyer, and then dancing up the stairs to her room, where she'd paw at the door. Then she'd get in, even if Edith pushed all of her furniture up against the door. And when she found her, Edith screams when her mother comes in a minute to check on her later, and it takes her a very long time before her heart stops pounding and the chills fade completely. Norman Hollis has always considered himself a simple man. His house is small and Spartan. His job, as town librarian, pays enough for basic amenities and a little more, and the only modern convenience he's even remotely interested in is the radio, which is as close as he dares to get to the wide and complex world surrounding him. He used to live in New York, but the manic bustle proved to be too much for him. Going out every day, weighed down by a suitcase, smothered by a stifling suit that grated against his skin and buffeted a churning sea of bodies. He'd had a breakdown. The general consensus with his family was that it had been a long time coming. "You were always so sensitive," his mother had said, shaking her head hopelessly, obviously wondering where she and her father had gone. He'd moved, not long after, to their obvious relief. Moth's Rest is a decent place, small, quiet, populated by the people who mind their business. He could take his time to forge bonds. Nobody pretends to be neighborly, and few are outright rude, though he knows that his reserved and peculiar nature has gotten a few tongues wagging. The best thing about it, though, was how intimately entwined the place was with nature. He'd never known just how much pleasure there was to be found in sitting down and watching the movement of squirrels and birds in the trees, or insects in the grass, or in closing his eyes and letting the clean, cool air caress his face. There's a park in the middle of town that he likes to visit every day. Smaller, but also wilder than Central Park. The little patch of land is nearly untamed, save for the pathway that curls through it and the branches scattered across it. It was all tall grass and statuary, hugged by creeping ivy and broad, sturdy oaks. He's there when he sees the woman. He's sitting in his usual spot, a thermos of soup held between his legs, his eyes closed. The air is cool and sharp against his face, and he keeps his eyes shut as he imagines gray clouds and Nordic ice caps. The shifting underfoot starts slowly. For a few moments he takes in the shushing of the grass and imagines that it's the wind. But then he feels something sharp-footed and quick against the skin of his leg. Then two more, and his eyes snap open. Upon pulling his pant leg up, he sees 3 beetles and 1 tick scuttling up his leg, fat bodies shiny even in the dreary light. He brushes them off with a disgusted squawk that turns into a shriek when he sees that there are more where they came from. The ground is alive with centipedes, earwigs, spiders, worms, beetles, and other insects. The ones that live deep down in the soil, they writhe and stream out from the earth, bending the blades of grass with the weight of their numbers, crawling over each other, a worse version of the manic hustle that he'd been stranded in back in New York. Norman twists his head away, feeling his gorge rise, and the motion brings the woman into view. She's moving down the path, not quite walking, more like strutting. A confident, quick pace, broken every few steps by a twirl or a pirouette or skip, like a schoolgirl going off to a dance. He would have thought it was a strange way to comport oneself if she was a normal person, but this isn't a normal person. A part of his mind recognized that before he actually realizes this. There's something wrong, something beyond the red dress, the large white hands with their long pointed fingers and the uncanny, barely human mask, something deeper. He gets the feeling like he's watching some undersea monster, like a giant octopus or jellyfish. It's poured itself into human clothes. There's an electricity, a soft, subtle bonelessness, the wrongness of which tugs painfully at the spaces between his eyes. She's closer now. Close enough for him to make out the damp look of her dress, with strange, circular patterns on the wrinkly fabric. Her head is pointed straight down the path, not seeing him, but she'll be passing by him any second. And what'll he do if she turns her head and sees him? Driven by pure revulsion, he clambers unsteadily over the back of the bench and lands amidst the fleeing swarms of insects. His skin tingles painfully, and he wants nothing more than to stop and rub them together until they, and maybe the world, feels better, but he doesn't, because the woman is across from him, with nothing but a little wooden bench between them. He turns and he gets up, feeling little legs on his skin moving up. The woman is still staring ahead, but her hand has come out. those long, long fingers stretching out like rubbery tentacles, feeling at the spot where he'd been a second before. She lets out a snort that might have been a laugh when he screams. And then she's gone. Norman scrambles to his feet and runs. He cuts through the park, sprinting faster than he ever has before, dodging trees, shivering as he passes through their shadows. He thinks their shadow might have crossed him. His skin is getting too hot, like a dozen warm hands are sliding across his skin, leaving fever trails in their wake, and the fabric of his shirt feels like sandpaper, even though he'd bought it because it never did. A sharp, painful bite on his nape causes him to flinch and turn on insect as he reaches a trembling hand to swat at whatever's bit him, and in that moment, he has a clear view of the sidewalk across the way. Sam Gage is there, walking alone, his coat slung over one shoulder, seemingly unbothered by the cold. Behind him is an embankment topped by a stone wall, and dancing quietly on top of it is the woman in the mask. Norman, his mind already overloaded with panic, screams, or at least he tries. Instead of a shrill note, a nasty mixture of dead leaves and bile spew from his lips. Sam stops a moment to stare at him, and the woman stops with him right above him. But as Norman tries to speak past the horrible, slotted stuff in his throat, the man turns and strides away, and the woman follows after. It's all too much. The horror of what's happened and what he knows will happen. His senses are on fire and there's too much in his head. It's like how it was the day in New York. He falls in a dead faint, face first into the grass, and his last thoughts are, "You did it in Times Square, you lunatic." Right there, in front of everyone. Sam Gage sees the man in the park throwing up and groaning. It's that odd guy who works at the library, he's sure of it. And while a part of him wants to see if he needs help, a larger part of him just wants to get home. Anna's boss has kept her back to do some last-minute edits to a last-minute submission to their magazine, and he wants to surprise her. There's a box of cupcakes from Harrison's wrapped neatly in his coat. It's her favorite bakery, and one that requires a month or so of planning in order to save up for. Used to require, he corrected himself, a smile pulling at his lips, tugging at muscles that hadn't been exercised, and he didn't know how long. I bet she'll be able to tell what happened just by looking at my face, he thinks with a faint chuckle. I bet she'll go nuts. Damp leaves squelch under his shoes as he turns a corner and starts down the hill, and he slows down to avoid slipping. Falling into the slurry and crashing his wife's present would mar his good day. Promotion be damned. The hill evens out, and the familiar houses of his neighborhood appear out of the evening gloom. He notes, with some surprise, that the typical conservative Keeners have put out jack-o'-lanterns, and with much less shock than the Talents have finished their little graveyard display, with the addition of a cardboard mausoleum that sways a little in the breeze. The mist is thicker now. Its fog lends the faux-weathered tombstones and the hollow-eyed plastic skeletons an open-air spookiness that Sam can't help but grin at. Something crunches wetly underfoot. He stops short, and the moment he does, a soft step scuffs the pavement right behind him. He whirls, silently hoping that he looks more stern than scared, in the event that it's just some kid trying to get a trick in before the big night. But there's nothing but mist, dead leaves, and quiet lawns. Sam feels a chill blossom in his guts, despite the comforting stillness. It's an echo, he tells himself. Gotta be. There's no place someone could hide in the time it took for me to hear them and turn around, unless they're tiny enough to hide behind one of those little tombstones. He wishes his logic was more comforting, but there's still a clammy, slimy feeling in his stomach, and the hairs on the back of his neck are prickling like the ticklish tread of a spider. He turns and keeps walking, on the alert, and more than a bit irritated with himself for it. The rest of the way home is mostly unremarkable. save for him spotting an oddly abundant number of worms and beetles along the way. But he's still relieved beyond a reasonable level when he finally shuts the door behind him and lets the familiar smells of home wash over him. His heartbeat slows and his breathing evens out. The realization of how tense he'd been the whole rest of the way draws a disbelieving snort from him. The kind of reaction, he thinks, is understandable in a woman walking alone at night in an unfamiliar part of town, but not for a 35-year-old man walking through a well-populated suburb in the early evening while it's still light out. What did I think was going to happen, he asks himself, forcing himself to speak louder than he usually did in an attempt to banish the last traces of worry. He removes his shoes, sets his wife's cupcakes on the kitchen table, and then sits on the couch, letting himself sink into the plushy fabric. The chill may be gone, but the back of his neck still prickles, even as the seconds turn into minutes and the silence of the house settles into his ears. Sam waits and wonders where Anna is as the sun starts to set and the skies, now clear, begin to fade to blue and red. The wind is picking up. He can see it from his window, sending the last batches of leaves falling to scuttle down to the street. I hope she's back soon, he thinks. It's getting cold. The blue sky darkens. The lights in the other houses start to come on, followed by street lights, cozy yellows and harsh whites disturbing the lightning shadows. The prickling at his nape has moved down to his arm. He's covered in goose flesh. He starts to worry. He knows that. He usually does when his wife is late getting home, but this time it's a stronger feeling. Not really worry, more like dread. All sorts of images, all of them unwanted, start to pop up. His wife in the embrace of another man, his wife bleeding out in some ditch somewhere, victim of some faithless maniac or violent gang member. A car wreck, a fire, a stick-up, some natural disaster, a faceless shade, only slightly darker than the mist around it, peering at him from behind a cardboard mausoleum. This last image, which feels like an intruder into his thoughts, has him standing on unsteady legs. The worry kindles into pure, unfettered, primal dread. The kind of dread that comes with the certainty, however devoid of logic, that something is coming. He stumbles down the hall and into the bathroom, slamming the door closed and locking it, as the walls seem to curve in on him, threatening to smother him. It's too much. He vomits into the toilet, and the dread pounds in the back of his skull like a migraine. Still dizzy, he turns and stares up at the ceiling, willing himself to count each spot in each tile. He makes it to the 24th spot before his hammering heart slows back down, and the world stops tilting. He's tired. The attack has left him sweating and weak in the limbs. His mind is still crowded, full of shame and worry and confusion. It makes him even more tired, so he closes his eyes and he focuses on each breath, pointedly not thinking about how his wife will react when she comes home and finds him like this. Outside, the rain picks back up, and in between its first peltering on the roof and his own shaky breaths, Sam hears the front door open. "Hon?" he calls out. No answer. He calls out again, louder, and hears nothing but the rain. The dread, which has been slowly smothering, flares to life again. His wife would have heard the fear in his voice and responded. It's strange, he can't hear its steps as it moves through the living room and down into the hallway, but he can feel it like he's felt it on the way home. He wishes he could get up, but his limbs are leaden. He feels like he's been sick for days, rather than a few minutes. A whimper bubbles up from between his lips, and he rolls onto his side, facing the little window at the top of the wall. It's much too small, but he crawls over and scrabbles against the tile like a rat anyway. The door opens behind him, and he feels like the air has been sucked out of the room. He begins to cry in earnest as he hears the soft, wet footfalls, and then tenses as her shadow falls upon him. She stinks like damp, forgotten, lonely places. Petrichor and the rotting, slithering things you find on rocks and inside of dead logs. Long fingers grasp his shoulder, and inch by agonizing inch, she turns him to face her. and he can't make himself look away. He sees the red flesh with its many sucking, hook-teeth mouths, the lumpen blue-white head with its gaping black eye sockets, and the large, tattered-lipped mouth. It's not a mask, but it's not a face either. There's something else behind it, something even worse. She shows him a glimpse of it, opening her mouth to display the red meat inside. Red jaws crammed full of thick white molars that are lapped and wetted by a long, barbed tongue. Her fingertips are hard and pointed like knitting needles, cold and unyielding as bone as she begins her work, undressing him, first to his skin, and then further. He tries to scream, but all that escapes his mouth is a slurry of wet leaves. Anna Gage returns home more tired than she's ever been. The last-minute article had needed more cleaning up than either she or her boss had anticipated, and now her hands, back, and eyes are aching. Who the hell thought hiring a 19-year-old was a good idea? She thinks irritatedly as she pulls into the driveway. It takes her a moment to register that the front door is wide open. But when she does, all the exhaustion rushes out of her and is replaced by the horrible certainty that something bad has happened. She lingers in the doorway a moment, staring at the leaves trampled on the floor before she musters up the courage to call out to her husband. The silence inside is deafening, and despite her fear, she goes in anyway. Sandra Davies, their neighbor to the immediate left, is pulled from her shows by a frantic knocking and hoarse screaming. She finds Anna trembling and wide-eyed, with skin that's gone gray and a trail of sick down her shirt. Her words are a babble, but Sandra heard enough to call the police. 2 officers arrive and enter and are almost immediately back out, running across the wet grass to call in the coroner. CSI. Anyone else they can think of. Soon the block is teeming with policemen. Families watch from behind curtains or open doorways if they aren't asking the policemen directly why their usual dinnertime peace has been ruined, and soon enough the word is out. There's a maniac on the loose. Anna is aware of the chaos on the very periphery of her thoughts, but the rest of her is whirring between the shock, the disgust, the denial, and the sorrow. Her husband is dead. She found him sitting at the head of the dinner table, steaming gently in the cool air, with red hands curled into claws and a mouthful of leaves. The only way she'd been able to tell it was him had been that whoever had killed him had left his face mostly intact. She had been married to him for 14 years. He completed some parts of her, helped fill in the gaps in her life, and she knew that she was the same for him. And someone had butchered him like an animal. By the time the night had run its course, she'll have been questioned, along with a man who'd been found passed out in the park, about what had happened. She'll say what she can, though her words will sound very far away to her ears, and when she's finished, she'll go back to the Davies and stare at the ceiling until sleep takes her. The police aren't gentle with Norman Hollis. They don't like his tone or his mannerisms, though they can't find anything to tie him to the murder. And when Edith Winthrop comes forward with what she saw, they decide that the killer, whoever she is some out-of-towner, a psychopath, drifting, riding the rails, hitchhiking where she can. And they despair of ever finding her. There's only one other witness to what's happened, though he doesn't tell until he's in his 20s. Harold Keener, who had gone out to add another fake tombstone to the collection. He saw her for only a moment. But it's a moment that he replays. First all the time, and then in the moment between wakefulness and sleep. An image of a woman with a swollen, monstrous head dancing down the sidewalk. Her white dress flecked with red. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and thank you for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's podcast, and thank you for clicking the thumbs up, the subscribe, the follow, the bell, the whatever helpful thing there is on such a platform. For those of you that live in cooler climates, you'll probably like to have a nice cup of tea. To get a nice cup of tea, my wife sells it. It's at etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocletea. You can get a whole bunch of different teas there, including creepypasta-based teas. And as always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody who is supporting me on Patreon. If you guys have been supporting me on Patreon, or if you're considering doing so, then know that I just added in a couple of cool things for the loyalty program because I found out that I could. I had no idea that I could do that. So now, you guys should be getting some cool things in the mail brought to you by Patreon that are pretty cool. They support the channel as well. Oh, getting to the point though, a huge thank you to patrons such as Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Brian Arce, Bobby Karman, Stephanie Butler, Tristain Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, William King, Heather McDonald, Reaper61167, Alex the Sandwich, Darth Miver, Michael Ortiz, Satanic Aries, Ness69420, aisodoehtraed with 2 exclamation points, Nessie, Ronnie Hansen, BardoHawk764, Melancholy Corpse, Ferb, Harley, Billy Morrow, Madam Skullbunny, Sashi Sazaku, Grizzly Olsen.pro, Kayden the Spooky Boy, Zane Nightshade, MyBodySoundsLikeRiceKrispys, Ashwood, Lord of the Weebs, Jay, Miss Xandra, Mr. Unsettling Spaghetti, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Azarine Fox, Fried Chicken 12, Freddy Krueger, Ty Nanny, Michael Scarborough, Infernal One, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Jordan Ells, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nina Smith, Nico Cayo, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, Trey Smiles, and Corey Kenshin. Thank you guys so much, so much for being a part of the Patreon and helping me keep the lights on and helping me get exclusive stories and everything that we do on the channel here. Thank you guys so much for being a part of it. Thank everybody in the description, and thank you guys who have stayed to this part of the video. It really means so much to me. I hope you all have a very happy Halloween and sweet dreams.